In this video, the topographical anatomy of the sulci and gyri in the cerebral cortex is going to be introduced. The cerebral lobes were introduced in the previous video. At the anterior pole of the hemisphere, the frontal lobe has three parallel gyri, divided by superior frontal sulcus and inferior frontal sulcus. They are the superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. The inferior frontal gyrus can be divided into the orbital part, triangular part, and opercular part. The precentral gyrus of frontal lobe is separated from these parallel gyri by the precentral sulcus. In the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, the olfactory sulcus lies longitudinally. This sulcus divides the inferior surface of the frontal lobe into the gyrus rectus and the orbital gyri. The anterior, posterior, medial, and lateral orbital gyri are separated by the sulci in an H shape. On the medial surface, the cingulate sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the cingulate gyrus of limbic lobe. The superior frontal gyrus is separated from the paracentral lobule posteriorly by the paracentral sulcus from the cingulate sulcus. The paracentral lobule is a connection between the precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. Behind the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. The posterior boundary of the postcentral gyrus is the postcentral sulcus. In the lateral surface, the parietal lobe has the superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule, which are separated by the intraparietal sulcus. The superior parietal lobule is continuous with the precuneus on the medial surface. On the medial surface, the precuneus is surrounded by the parieto-occipital sulcus, subparietal sulcus, and marginal branch of the cingulate sulcus. The inferior parietal lobule can be divided into the supramarginal gyrus and angular gyrus. The supramarginal gyrus surrounds the posterior ascending branch of the lateral fissure. Similarly, the angular gyrus surrounds the posterior end of the superior temporal sulcus. The temporal lobe also has three parallel gyri in the lateral surface. They are the superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri, which are separated by the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. Usually, the superior and inferior ones conjoin to form the temporal pole anteriorly. The superior temporal gyrus is continuous with the supramarginal gyrus of the parietal lobe. Similarly, the middle temporal gyrus continues to the angular gyrus of the parietal lobe. In the inferior surface, the inferior temporal gyrus is separated from the fusiform gyrus, or temporo-occipital gyrus, by the temporo-occipital sulcus. The temporo-occipital gyrus is separated from the parahippocampal gyrus of the limbic lobe by the collateral sulcus. On the lateral surface, the occipital lobe can be divided into the superior, middle, and inferior occipital gyri. At the posterior end, they merge to form the occipital pole. The superior occipital gyrus continues to the cuneus in the medial surface. The cuneus is between the parieto-occipital sulcus and the calcarine sulcus. It is separated from the lingual gyrus by the calcarine sulcus. The lingual gyrus is continuous with the parahippocampal gyrus. The inferior occipital gyrus is continuous with the inferior temporal gyrus. The insular lobe is deep in their lateral fissure. It is covered by the orbital gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus, precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, supramarginal gyrus, and superior temporal gyrus. The limbic lobe is surrounded by the lingual gyrus, cuneus, precuneus, paracentral lobule, superior frontal gyrus, and gyrus rectus. The cingulate gyrus surrounds the corpus callosum. The cingulate gyrus continues as the parahippocampal gyrus. The parahippocampal gyrus can be separated from the uncus by the uncal sulcus. The uncus is a triangular part of the temporal pole. It contains the head of the hippocampus.